Well, it's the second Sunday of the month, the second service, and this is the time where we try to do questions and answers. The questions that you put in the box, this is the time where I try to get up here and do my best to answer them. Well, I'm going to say this. I know I get a lot of threats about people going to put questions in the box to try to trip me up and all this kind of stuff. Well, somebody apparently had that in mind when they wrote this question I'm about to tell you. And I want to say this as we begin. The question was anonymous, but I want you to know whoever wrote this question, I'm going to do my best to hunt you down and find out who wrote this question. Now, all joking aside, but I appreciate it, and I think it's a good question, and we need to consider it. The question is kind of long, and I'm going to break it down into two parts. Let me just go ahead and read it to you first. I'll read what the question says, and then I'll explain to you how we're going to go about trying to answer this. All right? It says, if you have someone on life support, a machine, does it count as murder, which of course is a sin, if you take them off the support so that they will die? And the question goes on to say, you might say no because they already died or are going to die anyway, but then we're keeping someone alive as a sort of magic or devil act as seen in other cultures and countries. Could this also be seen, or could this be seen as a sin as well to God? Okay, I read this question a million times, and here's basically the way it breaks down. It breaks down into two parts. The first half of the question is, okay, if you have somebody on life support and you end up taking them off, they're of course going to die. Does that count as murder? Have you just committed murder by telling the doctor, take my loved one off of life support? And then the question also goes on to say, basically, well, is it even right to have someone on life support to begin with? You're basically keeping someone alive who is, may basically be dead. They may be brain dead or whatever, and you've got them on this machine keeping them alive. And a lot of other countries and cultures would look at something like that as magic. Or they might look at that as some type of devil worship or something. You're keeping somebody's body alive. Is it wrong to even have them on life support to begin with? So that's the basic way we're going to look at this question. We're going to look at both aspects here. Is it right to take someone off life support? Does that count as murder? And then we're going to look at, is it right to even put someone on life support to begin with? Okay, that's basically the way we're going to break this down. Okay, let's look at the first half of it here. Is it murder to take someone off of life support? Okay, well, let me just go ahead and answer it to you. As I have studied this, I would say the answer to that question would be no, it is not murder to take someone off of life support. Now, you may think to yourself, well, why not? Isn't that murder? I mean, you're taking that person's life, essentially. How could that not be murder? Well, we have to begin by defining what murder is. The question is asking here, is that murder? Okay? Let's start by defining murder. What is murder? Now, some people want to simply define murder as taking someone's life. Well, murder is more than that. This is what murder is. You can take time and look this up for yourself. But murder basically is, if you want to give a good definition of it, it is the deliberate, intentional, premeditated, malicious taking of someone else's life. Murder basically could be summed up like this. There's someone out there that I don't like. They've done something against me, and I want to get my revenge on them. There's malice in my heart, and I'm sitting there plotting of something I can do to kill them. And so I go out and get a knife and lay into them. That's murder. And I think the best example that we have of that would be in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, obviously. Cain took his brother's life, but it was murder. Because Cain was jealous of what his brother did, that he offered a sacrifice that God accepted, and God didn't accept his sacrifice, and so he went and killed him. That's murder. Now let's think about this. Okay, let's say you have somebody on life support, and the doctor tells you they're not going to make it. We have them on this machine, but it's pointless. They're gone. There's nothing we can do. And so you hate to do it, you don't want to do it, but you have no choice, and you say, well, I guess take them off life support. Does that fit the description that we just gave of murder? Does that fit the definition of murder? Did you do that premeditatedly? Did you do that with malice in your heart? Did you do that? No. That does not fit the definition of murder. Well, doesn't the Bible say not to kill? Well, if you look in verses like Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, there in the Ten Commandments, the Bible does say, thou shalt not kill. But if you look at the word kill there, that word kill means to commit murder. It again refers to killing someone with premeditation, with anger in your heart, that type of a thing. That's not what you're doing if you're just simply taking someone off of life support because they're brain dead or something like that. There's no hope for them. That's not murder. Now, I will say this, it could become murder if you got somebody on life support and you're thinking, I've been waiting to get you my whole life. Got you right where I want you. Doctor comes to you and says, should we take them off life support? You ain't got to ask me twice. Okay, that's a different story here. If Uncle Jimmy Joe, you're wanting to get his inheritance and he's on life support, you're just ready to pull the plug, that's a different story here. But no, if someone's on life support and there's nothing you can do, you're just prolonging the inevitable or whatever. And really, if you think about it, taking them off life support is not you killing them. All it is you letting nature take its course. You're not killing them, you're just simply allowing nature to do its thing. I mean, if you take them off life support, what's the natural thing that's going to happen? They're going to die. So, no, that's not murder. Now let's look at the second half of it. The second half basically says, well, should we even have them on life support to begin with, basically, because, isn't that kind of weird? Don't some people look at that as magic or something like that? Is it wrong to do that in the first place, to have them on life support? Now this is a little bit trickier of a question, and the answer I would give to that is, well, first of all, let me say this. Okay, is it true that certain people from certain cultures could look at something like that as being magic or devil worship or something? Of course some people could look at it like that. But just because certain people might look at it as devil worship or what, doesn't mean that it's wrong to do. For instance, if you look in verses like Colossians 4:14, the Bible talks about Luke. In that verse there, Colossians 4:14, Paul calls him Luke, the beloved physician. Okay, Luke was a physician. That means basically a doctor there in the first century. Now, doctors back then in the first century obviously can't do a lot of the things that we can do today, but they could do many things, and they did do a lot of stuff. And I'll say this, they did a lot more stuff than we think they were capable of doing back then. They would perform surgeries, they would perform different operations like that, and they would give people drugs or medicine and things to help them to get better. They did a lot of stuff like that. Well, don't you know that Luke, being a physician and doing a lot of the things that he did, that there were a lot of people in the first century who probably would look at what Luke did and said, that's witchcraft. That's magic. He just gave that person this pill or this medicine or something or other, and look what it did. That's magic. Does that mean that what Luke did was wrong just because other people might look at it as devil worship or something? No, it doesn't mean that what Luke did was wrong. Look at this verse. Look in Galatians chapter 5. If you go to Galatians 5, I think it's about verse 19, when Paul talks about the works of the flesh, one of the things that he mentions in verse number 20, as he mentions the works of the flesh, is witchcraft. He says the works of the flesh are, in verse 20, idolatry and witchcraft. Here's an interesting little thing you may not have known. If you take some time and look up that word witchcraft, that word actually means to administer drugs. That Greek word there, I know you don't like Greek, but I'm going to give you a little bit of it here, is actually the Greek word where we get our word pharmacy from. Now, you say, well, does that verse mean that we can't give drugs to people? Does it mean it's wrong to take Tylenol or take my medicine? No. Doesn't mean it's wrong for you to take your medicine. The type of giving of drugs that the word witchcraft is talking about here is it's talking about people who would take these drugs and these things in their idolatrous worship. They would take these things not as medicine to help them get better. They would take these drugs just to get a high. just for fun. Like people today who go out there and smoke crack. They're not doing that so they can get better. They're doing it because they want to have fun and enjoy themselves. That's what this is talking about here. In the ancient world, they would do that kind of thing for fun as entertainment and as a way to worship their false gods. So if you have people in idolatry who are used to taking drugs as a way of worshiping their false gods, as a way of practicing magic, and they go over here and they look at Luke who's giving out drugs, what would they probably think? Well, he must be doing magic too. Was he really doing magic? Was he really doing drugs the way they were doing drugs? No. He wasn't giving out drugs to just give people a high, or he wasn't giving out drugs just to help people feel better just because they wanted to have fun. He wasn't doing it to worship false gods. He was doing it as a way to help people get better. So just because people today could look at life support as a way of magic doesn't mean it's wrong. Now, let me say this. I don't necessarily see where it is wrong to have someone on life support. As I look at the Bible, I don't see where life support would violate any principles laid out in the Bible. But I will say this, you kind of have to think about it like this. Does it really make a lot of sense to keep someone on life support for a very long time? I mean, if the doctor comes in and tells you, like I've said before, this person is brain dead, we got them on this machine and it's keeping their body running, but they're not there. If the person is brain dead, they're gone. We may be keeping their body running, but they're gone. It's not necessarily wrong to do that, but why would you really want to do that? Now, I do know that sometimes they will do that. They'll keep a person's body on life support and keep the body running. That way they can take out the organs and can use those to help other people who may be in need. That would make sense, I guess, to do that. But if you have a loved one who's brain dead, it makes no sense for you to keep them on life support the rest of, for 20 years. Just have them laying there, their body running. Why? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do that necessarily. Now, some people might say, well, I don't really think life support will be right because it's just so unnatural. It's unnatural to do that, to keep someone's body running like that. I just don't think God would like that. Well, let me tell you something, folks. Any type of medical practice, anything, taking medicine, binding a wound, all of that is unnatural. Okay, if you go out there and you get a cut, do you naturally get a bandage that just magically pops up on there? Is that natural? No. Any type of medical practice you do is not natural. So that doesn't make it wrong. So, it's unnatural. That doesn't make it wrong. Then you might say, well, it just seems kind of gross to me, keeping somebody alive like that with a machine. Well, that doesn't make it wrong either. You remember in Luke chapter 10, I think it's about verse 33, the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the man was going down the road and the robbers jumped out and they beat him up and left him for dead, and the Samaritan came along and saw him there on the road. And the Bible says that the Samaritan poured oil and wine into his wound. Could you imagine doing that? Just think about it. Somebody may have been stabbed or something, and you go and you pour oil and wine into that bloody wound and you start rubbing. Isn't that gross? Well, does it mean it's wrong just because we might think it's gross? No, it doesn't mean it's wrong. So you can look at it and say, well, maybe it's wrong because some people look at it as witchcraft. That doesn't make it wrong. It may be wrong because it's unnatural. That doesn't make it wrong. Well, maybe it's wrong because it's so gross. Well, that doesn't make it wrong either. So I would say it's not necessarily wrong to have someone on life support because, again, as I've researched it, I don't see anything in Scripture where it would violate any principles laid out there. Now, I hope that answers this question. This is probably one of the toughest questions I've had to answer. It's definitely one in a category I've never really got up and answered before. So I really appreciate it. I think it's good to talk about these kinds of things. And I also want to say this. I know that when you get up here to answer a question like this, that what ends up happening is that people's minds start going 1,000,000 miles an hour. And they can't focus on the question that I'm up here answering because they're too busy thinking about other questions that pop up in their mind. Well, what about assisted suicide? What about helping someone with birth control? What about that? We're not here to answer all those questions today, okay? We're just here to answer the question on the card. If you have a question like that, a spin-off question, then please write it down and put it in the box and we'll get around to it. You say, no, you won't. Yeah, I will. You say, there's been questions you ain't answered before. Let me tell you something. I have answered every one of those questions that have been put in that box since it's been out there. I promise you that. You say, well, I didn't hear it. Well, I can't help it that you're not here to hear the question you put in. If you put it in there, I'm going to do my best to answer it, okay? So any spin-off questions that come from this, please put it in the box and we'll deal with it, okay? But again, my point here is just to answer the question that was asked me. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the question, another question here. And I think, again, this is a really good question, one that we really ought to consider. The second question, and I'm going to tell you before we ever get into this one's going to be a touchy subject for some people. Because a lot of people have a lot of prejudices, I can't even say the word, prejudices, built up in them simply from the way they were raised. And what we have to do as we consider this question is we have to be open-minded. What does the Bible say? Not what does my raising say. Not what did my daddy or granddaddy or mama and them teach me. We got to lay that aside and just look at what the Bible says. We are supposed to be following God, not the family traditions that we've inherited. Okay? The question is interracial wrong? That can be a doozy for some people to think about. Is interracial marriage wrong? What does the Bible say about that? Well, let me just go ahead and answer it for you. No, it's not wrong. How do you know that, preacher? Well, let me show you how we know that. Go with me to Numbers chapter 12. I think this right here ought to answer it for you. Numbers chapter 12. We think that interracial marriage is something new. Newfangled young folks wanting to be liberal, doing all this stuff, shouldn't be doing this. Old timers didn't do this. Let me tell you something. Number 12, this is old time. Then your granddaddy, this is old time here, folks. And guess what was going on way back here thousands of years ago? Interracial marriage. And guess what we're about to read? God was okay with it. Really? Yeah. Let's look at it. Numbers chapter 12. Let's look at verse number 1. All right. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he was married to an Ethiopian woman. Here comes Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother and sister, and they say, Moses, you done married this Ethiopian woman. She ain't the same race as you, ain't the same skin color as you. You did wrong. Boy, they just laying into him about it. Guess what happens? If you keep reading here in Numbers chapter 12, God comes down and God says His piece about it. And look what ends up happening to Miriam because of her getting on to Moses. Drop down to verse number 9. Look what happens to her. She's getting on to Moses because he married somebody of a different race. Verse number 9 says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. That's Miriam and Aaron here. And he departed. And the cloud departed off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said unto Moses, alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned. Think about it. God comes down, and what does He do to Miriam and Aaron? Miriam, Aaron, y'all are right. Moses, you shouldn't be married to that woman. That's not what God says. God doesn't get on to Moses. God actually comes and defends Moses. And God actually punishes Miriam and Aaron for being hard-headed the way they were about it. God actually causes Miriam to be leprous. And look what Aaron says about it. Aaron says, we have sinned. Some people think it's a sin to be interracially married. But this verse actually says it's a sin to be opposed to interracial marriage. You ever catch that before? Look what Miriam and Aaron were doing. They were causing this big ruckus, this big uproar, trying to go against Moses, causing this great big deal about his marriage. And God says, look, y'all sinned. And God punishes them for it. So this verse ought to make it clear to us, God is not opposed to interracial marriages. Now you might think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, hold on. Preacher? Say, I think I remember reading a verse somewhere in that Bible that says that interracial marriage is wrong. I think I remember a verse about God saying don't marry people of different nationalities. Well, there is a verse that does talk about that. And the verse you're thinking about is Deuteronomy chapter 7. Let's go ahead and flip our Bibles over to that verse. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7, and we're going to read starting in verse 1. And I will do my best to pronounce these names as best as I can, because these can be some difficult names to pronounce. Deuteronomy 7, beginning in verse 1. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou, and when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. Okay? This verse here, God is telling the people of Israel, don't marry people from different nations. Now, I think it's important that we emphasize this. God is not talking in this verse to the whole wide world. God is not saying to the whole wide world, I don't want anybody from any nation marrying anybody else. Egyptians, I don't want you marrying Chinese. Chinese, I don't want you marrying Russian. God's not speaking to the entire planet here. God is speaking to who? He is speaking to the people of Israel. He's saying to his people here, I don't want you marrying these other nations. Why did God say that? You ever notice that? Why? Did God say, I don't want you to marry these other nations because I don't want you marrying people with different skin color than you? I don't want you marrying these other nations because I don't want races mixing together. That's why I don't want you to do it. Is that why God said not to do it? Let's keep reading here. Look at the next verse. Verse number 4. Why do you not want us to marry these other nations, God? Look what he says. Their skin color's different. No. Verse 4. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly. The reason God told the nation of Israel, look, don't marry these other nations, is not because God was opposed to different bloodlines mixing together or anything. It just simply was the fact that God didn't want his people adopting false religion. So it's that simple. Now let me say this. If you've been paying attention, you might think there's a contradiction here. How is it that back there in Numbers 12, God was okay with Moses being married to some Ethiopian woman, but yet here in Deuteronomy 7, God says don't marry people from different nations? And guess what? Guess who's doing the talking here in Deuteronomy 7? Moses. Moses is actually the one talking here in Deuteronomy 7. He's telling the people of Israel, don't marry people from other nations. Well, how can he stand up and tell the people of Israel not to marry people from other nations when he's married to a woman from Ethiopia? How does that work? How's that not a contradiction? Here's the answer, folks. You have to look carefully at Deuteronomy 7. Deuteronomy 7 is not forbidding the people of Israel from marrying all different nations. But Deuteronomy 7 is actually forbidding the people of Israel from marrying from 7 specific nations. Look what it says here again. If you read the verse again very carefully, God says, do not marry people from these 7 nations. Ethiopia was not one of the nations specified here. So Moses was not wrong for marrying her from a different nation because she was not from one of those 7 nations that God said not to marry from. So even though God did put restrictions on the people of Israel about marrying people from different nations, it was not the case that God said don't marry people from any other nation, period. God said don't marry people from these 7 nations, because these are the 7 nations that are the most wicked. These are the most evil, and if you start marrying into them, I guarantee you it's going to lead you away. Now, if you continue to read on in Deuteronomy, God makes it clear that He did approve of His people marrying into different nations, so long as it was not from these nations that He specified, and so long as they went through proper protocol. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21. And I want us to begin reading starting in about verse number 11. Or actually, let's start in verse 10 just to get the context a little bit better. Deuteronomy 21, verse number 10. When thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thy house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month, and after that thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. Now here God is flat out telling them, look, when you go in here and you see some people from these different nations you would like to marry, you can do it, but this is what you have to do. First, you have to go and take this woman, and then the verse says you got to shave her head and cut her nails. You might think, well, what's that about? I don't really know if we fully know why they would do that, but I do think it probably had to do with idolatry. It probably had to do with purifying her from those idolatrous practices, because a lot of times they would do their hair and their nails up in a way that would symbolize their devotion to certain gods. And so what this basically would represent is, if you want to marry this woman, you got to purify her from this idolatrous practices that she's involved in. Certain things they had to go through. So I think it's pretty obvious when you look at these verses that, no, God is not opposed to interracial marriage. And here's another little fun fact for you. If you look in the genealogy of Jesus, did you know that Jesus had interracial blood in him? Matthew chapter 1, verse number 5 says that Ruth was a part of his lineage. Well, what was Ruth? Ruth chapter 1, verse 4 says she was a Moabite. She wasn't no Israelite, she was a Moabite woman. And yet here she is in the bloodline of Jesus. So for people who say, well, I don't think bloodlines ought to mix, well, what about Jesus? The man you call your Lord came from a lineage that was interracial. So I think this ought to answer that question. And again, we don't need to let prejudice or tradition, be what dictates that. And I want to end on this note. I want you to think about it like this. I know many of us have children. Let me ask you a question. We all white folks in here. All right? Would you rather your son or daughter marry a godly Christian black man or some ungodly, sinful, wicked white person? Think about it. Who would you rather have your child marry? I don't want him marrying her. She's black. Did you ever think about the person's character? Did you ever think that might matter some? Sometimes people care more about skin color than they do the type of person you're dealing with here. We have to begin to think more like God does. Remember what the Bible says? God does not look upon the outward appearance. God looks upon the heart. He looks at what's on the inside. And that's what we ought to be more concerned with. What's on the inside of this person? What type of person are we dealing with here? So I hope this answers that question. And again, if there's any other follow-up questions or anything else, you can see me afterwards, or you can put it in the box and we'll get around to it. As always, we want to take this time to offer the invitation to one who is in need of obeying it. If you're not a Christian, we give you the opportunity to become one. If you are a Christian but you've grown weak in the faith, we give you the opportunity to come back. If we can help you in any way, please let it be known while together we stand and sing.